Mexico. I'd yield to the gentleman if he wanted to address.
Thank you, and let me congratulate you and Ms. Capter and Mr. Hunter for your excellent work. And I find myself getting a little bit nervous in agreeing with the gentleman from California, with whom on many issues we don't have much in common. But the point that I just heard you make is an excellent point. It frightens me to think that if the global economy means that the future of a decent standard of living of the American people rests on the prosperity of an authoritarian, corrupt government in Mexico, then we are in very, very deep trouble. And it also seems to me that in a time when this Congress and this President are having such a difficult job improving the standard of living of ordinary Americans. Today there was a piece in the paper which indicated that there are 6 million children in America under the age of 6 who are living in poverty. We have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. 40 million Americans have no health insurance. We are losing millions of decent manufacturing jobs to third world countries. We have enormous problems in this country, which this Congress, President Clinton, President Bush, and others have been unable to solve. If we can't resolve our own problems, how in God's name are we going to be running the country of Mexico? So I would humbly suggest that we leave to our Mexican friends the difficult charge that they have to run and to try to improve the lives of their people, and that we should try to concentrate on our own needs here. And the other point that I would make is that I was at a banking committee last week, and at the banking committee meeting, in pursuing the bailout for Mexico, we had the Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, we had the head of the Federal Reserve, Mr. Greenspan, and we had the Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Rubin. My. All of these heavy hitters working night and day trying to help us bail out Mexico, and yet I look at what happens to family farmers in Vermont working 80 hours a week, losing their farms, 2 million people in America who are homeless, children who are hungry. Where are the heavy hitters who are standing up and say, we have an emergency right here in the United States of America? Our standard of living is in decline. Let's pay attention to that need. So I get a little bit resentful when all of this energy and all of this big money focuses on bailing out Mexico, and yet the needs of the American people seem to be ignored.
The gentlelady from Ohio.
Yes, I would like to add a point to that in terms of who we're willing to bail out and who we're not willing to bail out. One of the most advanced industries in our country is the airline industry. And every week, it seems, every few days, we see major articles in the newspapers across this country about the fate of U.S. Air, one of our major carriers which serves my hometown and is hubbed in different parts of the Northeast. There has been no surge, as far as I've noted, from those same three gentlemen that you mentioned, Congressman Sanders, who appeared before the Banking Committee to try to help U.S. Air work out of its situation where it's had some losses over the past several years to keep thousands and thousands of people on their jobs. I haven't received any phone calls, haven't seen any comments been made by anybody over at Treasury. Or, in fact, what's interesting is if you look back at the Chrysler situation several years ago before I got to the Congress, Alan Greenspan at that time was opposed to any federal involvement in the Chrysler bailout. Now, whether you agreed with the Chrysler bailout or you didn't agree with the Chrysler bailout, and they paid their money back with interest, as Lee Iacocca will remind us whenever you meet him anywhere in the country, he was opposed, and yet he's for this. One of the chief sponsors of this effort to try to find a backdoor way now of getting our taxpayers and our banking system to bail out Mexico. But yet when one of our own companies was in trouble, or now with U.S. Air needing a little bit of help, I'm sure the Secretary of Treasury hasn't been on the telephone, and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve with the head of U.S. Air. So I would agree with the gentleman. And while I have the floor for a moment, I just wanted to commend the gentleman from California, Mr. Hunter, who has also been on this floor so many evenings trying to and giving some incredible speeches that reached far beyond the Beltway into the hearts and minds of the American people, trying to show the people a new road, not a road that closes off America, but a road that is fair to American workers and builds democracy abroad. That's what we should be about here. And for those of us who have fought this long fight, it's a great fight to be in because we know we're right. And the American people are now listening. They know that something's up, and I want to thank the gentleman from Oregon for the special order this evening, and I yield back any remaining time to him.
Well, the interesting problem here is that we've been somewhat successful. I think when we first started to speak out against the Mexican bailout, it was pretty lonely. The Republican Speaker and the Republican Majority Leader in the Senate went down to the White House with the President and Alan Greenspan and the Secretary of the Treasury, Democrat President, and we had a bipartisan agreement that it was in the national security interest of the United States to bail out Mexico and to rush something through the Congress. But then a few of us started standing up and asking embarrassing questions about why this was necessary, why the haste, what was the collateral, what exactly was the national interest, whose money is at risk, questions that, of course, have never been answered. And in part, I believe that's why they won't try and move that legislation through the House. They don't want to answer those questions, the list that the gentlelady from Ohio provided about exactly who holds these securities that are at risk. They're trying to come in and tell us, well, it's pension funds. Well, we've made some calls in my district, and I know other people have, and we have yet to find anybody managing a pension fund that will admit that they were speculating in junk bonds in Mexico, bonds that paid between 20 and 50% interest. Now, I don't think there are very many prudent pension managers around the nation who were engaged in such speculation, but apparently Goldman Sachs was into Mexico very big time, $5.2 billion over 4 years, and who knows how many of their clients were at risk here, as opposed to Goldman Sachs itself as a firm, and how much liability they might have for having provided poor advice to their clients, talking about the emerging markets of Mexico. But in our success, it appears we're about to be short-circuited. Where we couldn't get $40 billion out the front door, it appears that the president is going to attempt to take $40 billion out the back door, still working hand in glove with the Federal Reserve, with secret amounts of money under terms not to be disclosed to the people's representatives in the Congress, working through the International Stabilization Bank. How much of the money being channeled through the International Stabilization Bank is flowing out of our Federal Reserve, working through the International Monetary Fund? How much of the money coming through the International Monetary Fund is money being channeled by the Federal Reserve of the United States of America? I haven't heard the outcry in Europe that we must stabilize Mexico in order to stabilize the world economy. I haven't heard those cries, but we've certainly heard the cries coming from the people running Goldman Sachs in Wall Street. So now it turns out that the president, even though he came to the Congress in a bipartisan way to propose this bailout, has decided, well, actually, he didn't need the authority anyway, that there's another way to structure this bailout using Section 5302, or Chapter 31, Section 5302 of the U.S. Code, stabilizing exchange rates and arrangements. The gentleman from Vermont's on the Banking Committee. I know the gentlelady from Ohio is more versed than me, but the way I read this, it allows us to engage in short-term swaps or exchanges of funds to defend the U.S. dollar, not 10-year loans to bail out a failing government in a collapsing economy. Would you want to address that for a moment?
I'm glad the gentleman brought up that point. Before I address that, let me just say that through our efforts, 80% of the American people oppose this effort to try to prop up the peso so that Mexico can pay its debts to Wall Street speculators. What's interesting is the Wall Street Journal today also said that 75% of the residents of Mexico City, the people of Mexico, were against the loan guarantee packages as well. So if the people of the United States are against it and the people of Mexico are against it, who is it that's ramming this through? And you asked about the Banking Committee. In my 8 years that I spent on the committee, I never saw the Currency Stabilization Fund used for this purpose. It was always used in small amounts, never to the tune of $20 billion We are trying to research back to see the largest such use of the fund, and maybe we found $2 billion back 10 years ago, but never to this extent, and never to defend the debts owed by another country. This is a very precedent-setting move that is occurring here. In addition to that, there is an additional around $17.5 billion coming through the International Monetary Fund, and at the moment it is unclear to us whether that is $17.5 billion in new money, because the U.S. contribution to the IMF has to be appropriated dollars through here. Are those old dollars? Are those new dollars? Where are those dollars coming from? And then the third element of this is the Bank for International Settlements, which is $10 billion. And it's very interesting because the Bank for International Settlements has a board, just like the Federal Reserve, has 24 members on the board. The United States had never participated on that board before. We weren't making payments. All of a sudden, who ends up on the board of the 24? Most recently, the chairman of our Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, and the chairman of the New York Fed, Bill McDonough. All of a sudden, and Citibank, surprise, surprise, is all of a sudden making payments into the Bank for International Settlements. Now, if it would happen that the debtors couldn't pay their debts, the burden of the Bank for International Settlements falls to the member countries to pay back. So they have a lot of different names, but it's the same people in these different institutions, and it all comes back right here to the taxpayers of the United States. And every single economist that came before our hearings, that Congressman Hunter and Congressman DeFazio, Congressman Sanders helped us organize those about a week ago, every single person said this was a set of credits that had high risk. This was not something where there was certain repayment. They expected losses. So we expect that there will be claims that will be made on the taxpayers of our country under this new scenario. So the gentleman is correct. I think what the President has done is just pushed the definition of what is in that section to the limits, both in terms of his own authority and the amount of funds that will now be drawn down for the purpose of not propping up the dollar, but propping up the debts that are owed to creditors by the government of Mexico.
Will the gentlelady yield for a moment?
I would yield to the gentleman.
The lady from Ohio mentioned that she read in the Wall Street Journal, I gather, that not only are the vast majority of the American people in opposition to this bailout, but in Mexico City, for interesting reasons having to do with the sovereignty of the Mexican people, there is strong opposition to this bailout as well. So on one hand, we have the American people in opposition. On the other hand, we have the Mexican people in opposition. But probably in the Wall Street Journal, if we went to the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, let me guess, the Wall Street Journal is strongly in support of the bailout, which takes us back to the scenario that took place some 14 months ago when we debated this issue of NAFTA right here on the floor of the House. And interestingly enough, the proponents of this bailout are trotting out all of the same figures once again. We have all of our former presidents who told us what a great deal NAFTA would be. They're out again. And all of the former secretaries of the Treasury who told us what a great deal NAFTA would be, they are out again. And all of the major newspapers in America and all of the large corporations in America who told us that NAFTA would significantly improve the standard of living of Mexican workers, while they're out again telling us editorially what a good deal this bailout would be. The truth of the matter is that, and I say this, and I know you've made this point before, we're not gleeful. We're not delighted to say that we were right about NAFTA and they were wrong. We're not gleeful. But we do think that it would be helpful for some of these editorial writers and the Wall Street Journal, instead of saying, let us pump another $40 billion of loan guarantees into Mexico, that maybe they may want to acknowledge that they were wrong. and that maybe we want to rethink. And I know that Mr. DeFazio has introduced a very important piece of legislation that I know we are on, which says, let us break the NAFTA agreement, let us withdraw from the NAFTA agreement. But it really does bother me that after misleading the American people, they are back 14 months later saying, oops, we made a little bit of, well, they don't acknowledge that they made a mistake, but now they proposed that we put another $40 billion in loan guarantees.
Well, actually, what they do is they say we never could have anticipated this. Of course, we talked about the fact that the peso was overvalued and would be devalued, and I mean, they can go back and review the debate, and actually, we told them, as did credible economists. But the gentlelady from Idaho, I believe, has a question she'd like to direct to the gentlewoman from Ohio, and I'd yield to her for that purpose.
I thank you very much, and being a freshman in this distinguished body, I have watched with great admiration as the gentlelady from Ohio has patiently explained to us and the American people much that we need to know, and I appreciate you very much, and I am learning from you. But I do want to ask either the gentlelady from Ohio or Mr. DeFazio, the gentleman from Oregon, my neighboring state. I have a question about the basic function and the statutory authority of the Bank of International Settlements. I was just shocked to realize that they too were a part of this bailout. It was my understanding that the Bank of International Settlements was set up to help with international disputes. And again, you know, I mean, Mr. DeFazio pointed out that there's no national security problem here, or no great national interest here. Where is the dispute? Can you help me out here? Can you help the American people out? So much is being skirted in terms of what our expectations should be in the way institutions function, as well as government. And it seems that the institutions are functioning outside of government, and it's a frightening thing.
First of all, I thank the gentlelady.
I'd yield to the gentlelady from Ohio to answer the...
I thank the gentleman. First of all, I want to thank the gentlelady from Idaho so early in her first term for being down here in the well, asking the right questions. And sometimes we don't always win our issues, but we find that if we give voice to the American people, even though sometimes we feel like we don't have a lot of power, with that voice comes greater understanding, and slowly you see a country change. And I think that's what we're about. And I am not aware of what the dispute is. The Bank for International Settlements was a consortium of central bankers that was devised in order to try to deal with some of the currency differences and for central banks to band together to give assistance where necessary if there were draws that went more to one country than to another country. But I, like the gentlelady, am quizzical as to what the dispute would be in this case. And I am very concerned about what the U.S. financial obligation would be if bills come due. I also wanted to place on the record this evening the gentleman from Vermont who has been so steadfast in participating in these special orders, to say you talked about the Wall Street Journal, one of the most respected publications in our country. And I read it every day, and many, many analytical articles are just superb. But I think it's important for the record to indicate that the former president of Mexico, the most recent president of Mexico, Carlos de Salinas, was appointed to the board of the Dow Jones and Company, which owns the Wall Street Journal. And it doesn't surprise me, therefore, as I read the various headlines in the Wall Street Journal and some of the hype that has been put into trying to make us seem like if we don't do this, there'll be an apocalypse. Just the headlines: Mexico worries spread to emerging markets. And then Mexico's currency plunges nearly 10% amid worries about U.S. rescue plan. Even the headlines, you start wondering, Headlines help to form opinion. They develop psychology. It's important to know who's in positions making decisions about this and influencing public opinion. So if I just might further respond to the gentlelady from Idaho, my hope is that as we get more details on the package over the next day, we hope we were not able to get the fine print today. We will be able to answer your constituents and our own with more specificity as to the role of the Bank for International Settlements in this. We know it's $10 billion. We don't know how that's being drawn down. We were not provided with any details today.
Well, I thank the gentlelady for answering the question as best we can at this time, and I think the gentlewoman from Idaho has raised an excellent question. I mean, the Bank for International Settlements, what is the United States obligation to that bank at this point in time? How is it that we came so recently to be represented on the board of directors by Alan Greenspan and the chairman of the New York Fed? What commitments has the United States made of either funds that are being channeled through the Federal Reserve Board in secret, or more overt agreements or obligations of the Federal Treasury? How much do we have at risk here? I think these are excellent questions that need to be answered. You know, there's this wisdom that somehow we have to allow the Federal Reserve to operate in secret because it's the only way to give them political independence. Well, the Bundesbank in Germany, I think, is the most highly regarded central bank in the world, and they are required to conduct all their deliberations, negotiations, discussions, and votes in public. But yet our Federal Reserve somehow is the only agency of the federal government more powerful than the Congress and the President combined in terms of the economic future of this country today, in terms of whether or not we bail out Mexico, whether or not we raise interest rates again to fight inflation that no one else sees except for Alan Greenspan and a few other inflation warriors at the Federal Reserve. They do all this in secrecy. They change the policies to say that, no, they think that 4% unemployment's a little too low and they'd rather have 6% unemployment because otherwise wages might go up a little bit, working people might earn a little bit more in this country, and that might cite an inflationary trend. At the same time, of course, they're tying us to international agreements and international institutions which are diminishing the role of U.S. labor. So on the face of it, their arguments aren't even consistent. But they don't have to account to anyone. They don't have to answer questions if we call down there. My staff called down today to ask about conflicts of interest by members of the Federal Reserve Board. Do any members of the Federal Reserve Board represent regional banks which are heavily invested in Mexico? And have they disclosed that fact? Have they recused themselves from voting as they apportion funds to bail out Mexico? No, we're not allowed to know the answer to that question. So, you know, what is this body we have created that is so much beyond the public and the elected representatives of the people? And its role in this bailout is just extraordinary. I'd yield to the gentleman.
Well, I think the points that you're making are absolutely correct. Ostensibly, we live in a democracy, and ostensibly, it is the President of the United States and the House and the Senate that represent the American people and presumably are elected to do the best that we can in representing the interest of the American people. And one of the aspects of this whole bailout, which bothers me very, very much, is that all over this country, the American people know what a lemon it is. They know that with a $200 billion deficit, and with people in this body talking about cuts in Medicare and Medicaid and nutrition programs for the elderly and for the children, that it is absolutely insane to be talking about putting $40 billion of American taxpayers' money at risk in this bailout. And it is not often, in my view, as the only independent in the Congress, that actually the Congress hears the needs of the American people. But guess what? On this particular instance, the Congress, the Republicans, the Democrats, the independent, heard what the American people were concerned about and made it very clear that the United States Congress was not going to support the Mexican bailout. So some of us, last night, we were saying, hey, every once in a while we actually win a victory. It looks like we are going to win this particular fight. But lo and behold, guess what? So what if many of the vast majority of the American people don't want the bailout? So what if the vast majority of Congress doesn't want the bailout? I guess the Wall Street Journal, the major corporations and the major banks in America do want it. So, hey, if it's between the American people and the Congress on one hand and the corporate world and the banks on the other hand, which way are we going to go? So, what the president does, which is really disturbing, I would have been disturbed if Congress had voted for the bailout, but I could have lived with it, just as I had to live with NAFTA. But the idea that the president circumvented the democratic process, pulled out some ancient, arcane law, which ostensibly gave him the authority, is very, very disturbing. And I frankly think that those of us who are in Congress who are concerned about this issue have got to deal with that statute and make some changes to it.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman's comments there, and I think it's certainly time to review this statute. It's obviously time to get some clarification from the administration on, exactly what authority they believe they do have. Are there no limits? We're now pledging $20 billion to Mexico. Is there no limit? What if the $20 billion isn't enough? And credible analysts came before our hearing, unlike the play-acting hearing put on by the Banking Committee, but a hearing where we invited people who had differing views from the administration and the bailout artists, and said, no, $40 billion won't be enough. Mexico is such a basket case. If you're going to tie the U.S. dollar to the Mexican peso, you better be prepared to defend the U.S. dollar against a run by the Japanese and the Germans and others, because they don't think this is a very smart thing to do. And they said, you can expect to be talking about $150 billion, not $40 billion. So does this stabilization fund, will the president, next week announce that, well, the $20 billion wasn't enough, and now we're going to go for another $50 billion or another $100 billion? And where does this money come from? As you said, we have a $200 billion deficit. Where does this money come from? I'd yield to the gentleman.
And I think the gentleman and the gentlelady might agree that if we were talking about loan guarantees, it might be appropriate to talk about loan guarantees right here in the United States of America. Can you imagine how many decent-paying jobs we could create right here at home, rebuilding our economy, both the public sector and the private sector, if we had loan guarantees right here? But apparently, uplifting the poor people of America, I always get a kick. I get a kick out of hearing how good it will be for our economy if we can improve the standard of living of Mexican workers. I happen to be very strongly pro-Mexican and very concerned about the problems and the poverty that exist in Mexico, and we all want to uplift the Mexican people. But how ironic that that same argument is not used here in the United States of America. 14% of our people live in poverty. Now, maybe if we invested in a jobs program, maybe if we rebuilt our cities and towns and our infrastructure and provided decent jobs for our people and uplifted them, maybe they would also be able to purchase the goods and services that right now corporate America wants to sell to Mexico. But apparently that is a very, very radical idea to suggest that we might want to uplift the poor people in America rather than the poor people in Mexico.
Didn't the gentleman identify an article yesterday that said that because of the economic straits that our country's in, that we're going to have to lower the loan guarantees made available to small businesses in this country?
By the small businesses?
In my state, the thriving growth of the last 20 years has come from small businesses. Yes, we've had a few big corporations move in, but generally we can identify most as the growth is coming. And now we're going to have to cut back on loan guarantees for small businesses in America while we extend $40 billion to Mexico. Didn't you show me an article?
You're quite right. That was in the Washington Post, I believe, yesterday, and it dealt with the Small Business Administration. That's correct.
That's extraordinary. So somehow, I guess small businesses in the United States aren't a good risk, or we just can't afford them even if they are a good risk. So we're going to have to cut back on that extension of credit. But a regime in Mexico which has had 3 major financial crises, essentially 2 previous defaults in the last 12 years, which is an authoritarian regime, which has lowered the standard of living of its own people by 25% in the last decade, which has, however, created 24 billionaires in a mere 7 years, is somehow a great credit risk, and there's nothing to worry about. But American businesses, well, I'm sorry, we can't afford to extend that kind of credit to American businesses. We're just going to have to cut that program back. And we're also going to cut out loans, rural electrification loans, and other things. Because we do have a budget crisis, and I agree. And it's time to get it under control. But how is it that suddenly when we have to bail out the savings and loans, we can do it off budget? When we have to bail out Mexico, we can do it off budget. But if it goes to average American people and their concerns, their small businesses, their livelihoods, their education, we're broke. Now, this is a strange parallel to me.
The other irony, I think, perhaps the interesting irony in this whole affair is that while I personally happen not to be a great believer in the free enterprise system for many reasons, I do respect people who take a risk, and then having taken that risk, if they do well, they earn a whole lot of money. I think that's okay. But when you take a risk, by definition, there is a chance that you may lose. I find it as really outrageous that the people who invested in Mexico, especially after the NAFTA agreement, they invested a whole lot of money, and they expected a high rate of return. Well, things did not turn out the way they expected. That is unfortunate. But in Vermont, small businesses are having very great difficulty. Family farmers, workers having very great difficulty. And yet they do not have the United States government guaranteeing their investment. What a wonderful world it is for Wall Street investors. It's heads I win, tails you lose. Heads, I win and get a large rate of return from my investment in Mexico, or tails, you guarantee my investment. Sorry, the American taxpayer. So they make these investments, and then they come crawling into the Congress and say, gee, Congress, gee, Mr. President, we, very, very wealthy people, may have to lose some money. That's unacceptable. We're very wealthy. We're not supposed to lose any money. So you ordinary Americans, average taxpayers, workers who may have seen your jobs go to Mexico, why, we want you to bail us out. And the leadership of the Republican Party and the President and Mr. Greenspan say, well, that makes sense to us. Hey, that's a good idea. We will guarantee your investments. Oh, that the average American small business person had that type of support behind him or her.
I think if the gentleman would yield back for a moment, I think a lot of our colleagues aren't aware of the fact that a lot of these short-term teso bonos that the Mexican government can't turn over are paying rates of interest between 21 and 50%. Now, I don't know, but if someone offered me a 21% rate of return on my modest savings, I might say, well, isn't there a risk? That seems like an awful high rate of return. And if they said, oh, no, Congressman, don't worry about it, there's no risk at all, I think maybe I'd make a few phone calls. But the Wall Street people, the Goldman Sachs firm, which is to Mexico for $5.2 billion over the last 3 years, and others, said, oh, no, this is an emerging economy. There's no risk. This is just sort of like the United States, except the people speak Spanish. There's no risk down there. Don't worry about the government. Why, they just had an election. Well, they had an election 6 years ago. It was a great election. The party that lost won, and they were the one we liked the most. And this last time, the party that we liked the most, well, they won again. They may have fixed the election, but they always win. So there's no risk, and they don't allow people to organize labor unions. And if they do organize a labor union, don't worry. We also control the judiciary, because we don't have an independent judiciary in this country, and the judiciary will take care of those pesky people trying to drive up wages in Mexico. So we'll keep wages down there even lower than we can drive wages in the United States. So your investment in Mexico is totally safe. This is what's extraordinary to me, that we have allowed this thing to spin so far out of control that we got sold such a bill of goods, not you and I, since we voted against the NAFTA agreement, but so many of our colleagues, and now we are going to go to this extent to cover some very prestigious fannies around here and extend $40 billion of our taxpayers' money to bail them out. They couldn't get it through the Congress, to the credit of this institution, but now they're going to find another way to do it. I'd yield back to them.
I think at this point there may be some Americans who are wondering what they can do about this fiasco. And I think the iron law of politics is that government will often try to get away with as much as they can until people stand up and say, sorry, you're not going to do that. So I think I would speak for you and many members of Congress who are saying to the American people, we have enough problems at home. We have a $200 billion deficit and a $4.6 trillion national debt. We don't think it makes a lot of sense within that context to be bailing out an authoritarian and unstable government and a very shaky economy in Mexico. I would very strongly urge the American people, write to the President, write to your members of Congress and say, wait a second, we want you to stop this $40 billion bailout. So I would hope that the American people would stand up and say, no, Mr. President, no Republican leadership. Let's reinvest in America. Let's control our own deficit. So I hope we don't take this lying down. If people stand up and fight back, we can yet turn around this fiasco.
I thank the gentleman. I think these are an extraordinary couple of days in the history of this republic. The House of Representatives and the Senate did stop the bailout of Mexico, or at least indicated that they weren't willing to go along readily. That was great. But now we've seen an end run around the Congress of the United States with a creative interpretation of a statute and another way to send $40 billion out the back door that Congress wouldn't let go out the front door. And yet again, the Federal Reserve is going to meet tomorrow to try and visit another catastrophe on the American people, to raise interest rates, to banish the threat of inflation that doesn't exist, 30-year low in terms of inflation statistics, to drive up unemployment. That's the policy of the Federal Reserve. Did this Congress authorize the Federal Reserve to drive up unemployment? Is that the underlying laws and statutes in the United States, and is that the authority we extended to the Federal Reserve? Your charge is to drive up unemployment because we don't want to see wages go up in this country? We don't want people to make a better standard of living? That's not what I got elected to do. So I believe there's some extraordinary questions here, and they all seem to come back to the same very small influential group, the Federal Reserve, a few people on Wall Street, and some people in the administration, some of whom used to work on Wall Street very recently, earning up to $26 million a year, advising their company to invest $5.2 billion in Mexico, and now want to bail out Mexico. These are extraordinary times, and the people should be very attentive to what's going on here. I'd yield back to the gentleman, and I think we're going to run out of time.
What especially distresses me, as you know, in this last election, only 38% of the American people bothered to vote. And I think the reason for that is so many people there just shaking their heads and they're shaking their hands and they're saying, hey, I really have no power, I have no authority. And what this whole business indicates is we can understand why people are giving up on the democratic process. Because here you have, for once in a very long time, the Congress of the United States actually doing the right thing and saying no to the bailout. And yet we still can't win. So next time when we run for re-election and you go back home, people are going to say, well, what difference does it make? You're trying to do a good job, but they're going to go around you anyhow. You don't have enough power to represent ordinary people. And I think that's a very sad thing at a time when many of us, I know the three of us, are reaching out. We want working people and we want poor people and we want the elderly to get involved in the political process. This action on the part of the president just discourages, I think, millions of people who say, hey, it doesn't make a difference. Wall Street has made a demand and the president has succumbed to it, and it doesn't matter what ordinary people think.